This is my development diary for A Glimpse Beyond, my third year major project. It is a horror puzzle game which plays with the player's perspective and experiments with reality warping puzzle mechanics. What you see on screen is the current build. There are still some bugs here and there, but overall, it all works quite nicely. But it wasn't always like this. How did we get here? As with all games, it started off with concepts. Many concepts, most of them were scrapped. I toyed around with ideas such as platformers or something wacky and physics-based, but none of those concepts really went anywhere. One concept, however, that did take off was my desire to create something in the theme of eldritch horror. I was definitely inspired in part by Bloodborne, one of my favourite games of late, and also from listening to H.P. Lovecraft's works in audiobook form in my spare time. One idea in particular that fascinated me though was the concept of getting a glimpse into another world. This is actually where the game's title, A Glimpse Beyond, comes from. The game's title actually came to me before most of the ideas for the gameplay did. So I took the idea of getting a look into another world, and I paired it with lenses. From here, the gameplay blossomed. In my research I came across a particular type of shader called a stencil shader. It is visible in games such as Antichamber, and it has quite a unique effect. As soon as I saw it in action, I knew that I had to have it in my game. For this project, I decided to use the Unity engine. I made this choice as I have had previous experience with Unity, and with my knowledge of C#, I was pretty confident I could make something really cool. So, armed with the Unity engine and my limited knowledge of C#, I created a new project. I purchased the horror FPS kit for Unity as I knew my game would be a horror game going into it. This gave me a big kickstart in the development of my game, as it comes with a lot of pre-made assets and a lot of features built in. After following a couple tutorials, I managed to get the stencil shader system set up and working pretty quickly. I spent a not insubstantial amount of time just playing around with the final result. It was pretty impressive to see on my own screen. Seeing this effect reminded me of some of the other games that I've played that also feature reality warping effects. One of these is Superliminal, a game that plays around with the size of objects and allows players to make them grow or shrink based on their perspective. This made me want to experiment with the stencil shader and see what I could do with it in terms of playing with the player's perspective. The idea that I came up with featured the player walking through a hallway with a 90-degree turn in it. In this hallway, they can see a garden outside, but when rounding the corner and looking out of the window again, the view has changed and they are now in a huge tower looking down into a bottomless pit. After getting a few people to play through this short section, and getting mostly positive feedback, I decided I wanted to keep going down the route of playing with people's perceptions. Going back to my first test with stencil shaders, I realised that I had an idea for a puzzle mechanic. I wanted to see what would happen if you were able to actually reach inside the box and pull out an item, and the item that you would pull out of the box would change depending on what angle you were viewing the box from. With this in mind, I set up a simple puzzle, or so I thought. The idea being that the player would need to walk around the cube and pull out the correct item to place on the stool next to the door to be let out. This, however, is where I would encounter the majority of my technical issues throughout the development of this game. As you can see, I encountered bugs. Bugs upon bugs upon bugs. After a lot of trial and error with potential solutions and a lot of failed solutions, I eventually got almost there. Emphasis on almost. Thankfully, this happened to be a relatively easy fix. All I had to do was write a couple lines of code that disabled the bowl whenever the Buddha statue was taken out of the box, and then enabled it again when it was placed back inside of the box. As you can see, the puzzle box mechanic is now thankfully functional. It took quite a few late nights to get working, but I think it was worth it in the end. Now all I had to do to make this puzzle fully functional was to make the door unlock when the correct item was placed upon the pedestal next to the door. Thankfully this was a lot simpler to get working than the puzzle box. All it took was a few hours to get to grips with how the built-in door's code worked and how to make the pedestal interact with it. That being said, there were a few issues with the physics that needed fixing, but they weren't too pressing at the current time. Now that I had this working, I wanted to get started on a second puzzle. In this second puzzle, I wanted players to get a little bit more involved with the puzzle box. The natural progression, I felt, was to have not one, but two movable objects this time. One of the objects was to start inside the puzzle box, and another one on a shelf nearby. The goal with this was to test whether the player was familiar or not with how the puzzle box worked, as they would have to grab the second item from outside the box, put it into the box, and then walk around the other side of the box and pull out a different item to use for the puzzle. In the room for this puzzle, I also was a little bit more ambitious with the set dressing. I wanted to make it feel a little bit more like it would be inside of an actual house. Also, as you can tell, this version of the game is very dark, as I haven't gotten to grips with how to light my scenes properly yet. Don't worry though, as this is something that I do get around to and fix later. The physics issues are still on my to fix list, however. Whilst the puzzle box for this room may seem pretty seamless, it was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire development process. As the box in the first room was only coded to work with one item, I had to rework almost the entire system to make it work with two items. It was also around this time when I started playtesting my game a lot more. I even had people speedrunning it now and then. I think the record was 1 minute 28 seconds for both puzzles, which I unfortunately don't have any footage of due to technical issues. Some of the feedback suggested that I should make it a bit more clear when the player has done something correctly, which makes a lot of sense, as currently the only thing to signal to the player that they've done something correctly is that an unlocking sound will play when the door is unlocked. To remedy this, I have put a light next to where an item is required to unlock a door. If the correct item is on the pedestal, then the light will light up. It was around this time that I had to take a break from this project to work on a commercial VR project. I did learn a lot whilst working on that project, however it did take 2 months of time away from this project that I could have spent further polishing or adding to this experience. 2-month break over and back fresh to work on this project. I was full of ideas for new puzzles, but unfortunately there wasn't enough time to add any of these. Instead, I realised that I was probably better off polishing the existing experience to make it the best quality that I could with the time I had left. Going back to the beginning of the game, it was quite obvious from some of the playtesting that players were missing the change of environment between the two sides of the building. Many players would walk straight past the second set of windows and not even think to look outside. To remedy this, I made a rain effect using a particle system. I placed this just outside of the window where the tower is. I then created a simple lightning effect using a spotlight with a script attached that made it flash every so often. To accompany the rain and the lightning, I found a free-to-use rain and thunder sound effect online. I placed this in the scene and adjusted the parameters so that it was only audible when the player was in sight of the lightning and rain. Whilst I would have liked to have made it so that the lightning could have flashed through the windows, I was unable to make this effect work. The next change I made was to narrow the corridors. This was so that it would feel more like an actual house. Previously the corridors had a square cross section and this felt very unnatural to walk through. The narrow corridors also help to draw the player's attention to the windows. This further increases the chance that the player will notice the stencil shader effect out of the window. The final thing I added to this build was this final room. Connected are 3 adjacent rooms, each of which, in a later build, would hold a puzzle. These rooms are all linked to the 4th door, which is in the centre just above on the balcony. When all 3 puzzles are completed, all 3 lights above the door will be lit and the door will pull open, allowing the player to move forward. This allows the player to move from puzzle to puzzle if they get stuck, and also introduces the player to the idea of multiple puzzles connecting to one door. This has been my dev diary for A Glimpse Beyond. Thank you for watching.